It only took 4 seconds for Cuphead to capture the people's attention back at the 2014's Microsoft E3 press conference, while they were showing a clip filled with indie games that are coming to the platform. The aesthetic of the game is no doubt the culprit for bringing eyeballs and anticipations. Ever since then, it has been a game that sparks conversation and excitement whenever it appears on screen in the upcoming year's conferences. A pretty basic old school run and gun shooter is what I thought whenever I see Cuphead prior to its release, and somehow alongside with the development of the game, it was said to be a difficult, challenging game reminiscing of retro games within the genre such as Contra. Cuphead was supposed to be a boss rush game in early development too, but after some time, StudioMDHR, the creator of the game, decided to implement platforming stages to mix up and flesh out the game. After beating the first playthrough by getting the best rank in every levels, I would say that the game still feels like a boss rush game despite having some platforming levels in between. I do have something to say about the difficulty and the challenges the game is trying to impose, alongside with the ups and downs of the game. But first, let's tap into the very best of what Cuphead has to offer, the aesthetic. Cuphead's visual is entirely based on old-time cartoon back in the 1930s. Even though most of us probably had never associated our lives with that sort of animation and art style, except maybe have watched some clips randomly online, looking at Cuphead will make you realize immediately that it looks exactly like the animations in that era. The artists have successfully captured how the art and animation works from the past and brought it into the screen. Don't get me wrong, I'm no expert on animation myself. Most of what I've consumed related with animation are mostly anime, which is very different with the material discussed here. But that's the thing. Cuphead captures everything of what I've always perceived of those old-time cartoons. The sort of uncanny movement of the characters, the grin on the villain's face, the amount of frames used in the animation, the exaggerated effects such as the smokes and the fire, and the wiggly limbs. Everything just ticks, and that's why it is impressive to me. I really have to give it to them for not only bringing the art back, but also capturing it so precisely with details. As you play, you can sense that they take a lot of pride with their visuals too. The UIs are deliberately small so they do not block the screen. They have multiple filters to further mimic the old-timey feelings too, and they even put the artists and the animators in front when the credits roll. The visuals also kept me going onwards, wanting for more. Bosses are not only imaginative, but also unpredictable in terms of their looks as well. Every transformation of each face has the sort of surprise factor that exceeds beyond your initial imagination. I have the urge to see what's next constantly. What bosses will I face and how they are going to fend themselves as I try to beat them. To go even further, the game uses sound effects produced using the Foley method, increasing the authenticity of its presentation. To those who are unfamiliar, Foley is a process of creating sound effects using daily life objects, recorded separately in a studio. I'll leave a video link down in the description about the making of Foley sound, so check it out if you're interested. Speaking of sound, the music of the game is brilliant as well. The tracks are orchestrated, and the excessive use of wind instruments really brought me back in time. Do expect a lot of trumpets, trombones, and saxophones throughout the tracks.
Mr. King Dice, I'm the gamest in the land. I never play nice, I'm the devil's right-hand man.
The strongest suit of the game is no doubt its presentation. It definitely lives up the standard from what we initially saw. Recapturing something that's considered outdated and presenting its brilliance so convincingly is truly plausible, and I can adore Cuphead solely with this achievement. Next, let's get into the gameplay. Like any other shoot 'em up games, players can acquire different kind of shots for their character, but in Cuphead, they are not obtained within levels as power-ups like in Metal Slug and such. Rather, players have to buy them in the shop and equip them in the loadout system prior entering a level. Although the shots and the abilities are permanent purchases, I don't see the necessity of having the items locked behind a purchase order, which means you have to buy a certain item before other items appear in the store. This system will be useful if the weapons are progressively better onwards, but in Cuphead's case, every shots and abilities are uniquely useful on their own and befitting to a certain playstyle or stages. So I don't think it is a good idea to lock some items behind the front line. Just lay everything out for players to choose right off the bat should be the better way to dispense purchasables in this game. The shooting uses 8 directional shooting, which is self-explanatory, and there's another important mechanic accompanying the gameplay, which is the parry slap. By initiating a spin when the jump button is pressed in mid-air, players can parry off pink objects during the spinning state. It seems like a lot of players are confused on the timing of the parry. Note that it's the spin that tells when you can touch the pink object. You have to press the button slightly earlier before you land on them. I can't blame people for getting confused on this. I think the tutorial can definitely use some illustrations to explain it better. With parry slap, instead of shooting and dodging, pink objects prompt you to approach them. While it is much more riskier, it rewards you an EX bar, so you have this risk and reward going on while you are fighting bosses. Bosses in Cuphead are all pattern based. Players have to recognize the movement and projectile patterns in order to dodge them accordingly. Their attacks are telegraphed by animation, sound and color, so players have time to react. Pretty standard stuff, but I'll get into more of that later. Aside from the usual fights on the ground, there's also aerial boss fight that brings you up in the air and play as airplane. It is nothing too different with the ground fight. Aside from replacing the dash into a shrink mechanic that narrows down your character's hitbox and the restrictions of only having 2 preset weapons and 1 super art unique to the mode. But it keeps things fresh having to play in a slightly different mode throughout the game. As mentioned, Cuphead was built as a boss rush game initially, and after finishing the game, I feel like they retained the boss rush feeling pretty well despite having some changes. First of all, there's only 3 mausoleum stages in total, which rewards you a super art upon beating the parry challenge, and 2 platforming stages in each world. They adds up to only took about 30% of the entire game. The others are all boss levels. The incentives of the platforming stages are the gold coins. Players have to find the coins within these levels in order to purchase items from the store, but the coins are not well hidden at all, so collecting them is less of a challenge. However, every single one of these stages have their own gimmicks to spice things up. They never felt the same, offering different kind of challenges. With that, I don't consider them as filler, but they are definitely less enjoyable compared to fighting bosses. Secondly, there's no exposition at all going into levels. The game tosses you straight into gameplay. Bosses don't get any introduction either. It is just a straight up fight after the loading. The length of each boss fight is worth mentioning as well. None of the fights last over 2 minutes, which is pretty compact if you consider all of them have at least 3 phases. Nonetheless, they are all visually impressive and creative throughout all phases. Due to the big chunk of the game consists of boss battles and how quickly they throws you into the fights that will also end swiftly, it still feels like a boss rush game through and through. Now, with all that said, let's dive into the difficulty. The conversations around the game ever since the release have been on the topic of difficulty, and I do have my fair share of opinions in regards to it. Personally, I think the difficulty only kicks in when you are trying to get the perfect rank in every levels. If you don't mind getting other grades, I do think it is still a pretty challenging game, but not to the point where it is outraging. The main thing is to learn all the patterns, get used to them and dodge them accordingly. It will take you some time for sure, just don't expect to first try any of the bosses. But if you are aiming for the best grade, the difficulty ramps up significantly. There are a few problems that contribute into this factor. The first one, which is the bigger culprit, is the requirements themselves. In order to get the best grade, players have to defeat the boss within a time limit, do not get hit a single time, parry slap at least 3 times, and use at least 6 EX meter before defeating the boss. Generally, this scoring system is flawed and badly thought out in my opinion. Now let me explain. The time requirement and the parry slap counts contradict each other due to the nature of the game. Remember I said all bosses are phase and pattern based earlier? The problem lies within this. While I appreciate there are multiple different attacks within phases to make the gameplay more lively instead of repeating the same cycle, some attacks do not have pink projectiles for you to parry. So if the game happens to rotate into these attacks more often, you are doomed. The match is straight up invalid because you can't make the parry quota before defeating the boss. On top of that, most bosses have at least one phase in their fight that will not generate pink attacks. Account that in, and you really have to take your chances whenever a pink one comes up. So what if you wait, stop shooting the boss to hold them from changing phases and stall in the current phase for some parry chances? Time is ticking, and you risk missing the time target for that. This is where the randomness exposes the weakness of the scoring system. I can't tell you how many times I've got less than the required parries before switching phases, just because the game decided not to spawn at least 3 of them in the previous phases. To be fair, this problem is not haunting all bosses. Most of them still have more than one phase with ping attacks, and some of these phases are generous with their numbers too, so you may encounter 3 parry chances fairly easily. But the probability of not spawning any ping attacks is still present in some fights. I've encountered this problem in my first playthrough enough times for me to think this is a legit issue. This is easily one of the most infuriating problems I have while trying to get the best grades in regular mode. The other problem related with the difficulty of the game is the attack patterns themselves. Some attacks when combined will overlap each other and lock players in a position where there's no way to escape but to take damage. Before I explain further, I would like to clarify that not every boss in the game suffers from this problem. To give them credits, most attacks from the game are spaced out far apart from each other so they will not intertwine, which is good. So, I'm suspecting this problem might be a common one across all run and gun and shmup games. It might be the genre working its own nature here. I simply did not play enough games within the genre in the past to properly distinguish whether is this a reasonable issue or not. So I remain suspicious on this attack pattern problem alone. I would like to hear from you, whether if you are an experienced shmup player or someone who loves the genre, so leave a comment if you have anything to say. So yeah, sometimes the attacks from the environment together with the boss attacks will push you to a corner. A way to decrease the chances of that happening is to keep positioning yourself in a spot that allows you to dodge attacks in any direction prior to the launch of the attacks, so that you can react towards them quickly and get back to safety. For example, keep going back to the middle of the screen after dodging anything at all. You have more options to go to if you are in the middle. Position itself is as important as reaction and agility. And then there's also the previous attack. If the first pattern has already pushed you far away, it will make getting back into position harder before the second one comes out. The challenge here is to find the correct path to dodge the first attack. If you pick the wrong direction to avoid them, the possibility of getting locked by the upcoming attack is significantly higher. And if you don't have your smoke bomb charm equipped, you cannot escape these unfortunate situations either. It is really unforgiving considering there's only one possible way to fully avoid getting hit in a lot of scenarios. But that's the kind of challenge longtime fans want at the first place, I suppose. Once again, I want to clarify that not every boss suffer from this. Those that are more conspicuous with this issue are the 2 auto-scrolling ones, namely the dragon and the queen bee, the clown in World 2, and lastly the devil, especially in his second last phase. The platforms coming out from the dragon and the bee levels adds another randomness on top of the problem. Positioning yourself is not impossible in these levels per se, but if you happen to stand or land on a platform that doesn't favor you with the upcoming attack, you'll be punished. As for the devil, there's simply too many elements going on in that specific phase. The clown is the most infuriating one, and I believe I've already shown you enough with the footages on screen. If you have a few hit points to spend, the problem solves itself by just tanking through the attacks, but as I say, if you want the perfect score, you cannot be touched, which again makes the challenge infuriating. In defense of fairness of the game in general, attacks are telegraphed properly with visual aids and even sound effects. Bosses will have wind-up animation before an action, different colored attacks behave differently, and most attacks are spaced out from one another to avoid what I just pointed out just now. So they are definitely designed to be fair at the first place. It's the occasional overlapping patterns that does it, which is a shame. With all that said, however, I believe it is still a pretty challenging game no matter you want the perfect score or not. The scoreboard requirements is the bigger problem here, and they are going against the nature of the game. It feels like a checkbox to use every mechanics. Parry slap 3 times just because. Use the super meter at least 6 times for the sake of it. Isn't keeping the meter and beating the boss solely by using normal attacks requires higher skill to achieve? Coupled with the problems of the attack pattern that I explained just now, I have very little interest on getting full S rank on expert mode, because I do not want the game to frustrate me any further. Full A+ is enough for me, and I'm usually the kind of person who likes to 100% games. Still, I remain skeptical on the pattern issue whether it belongs to the nature of the shmup genre itself or on Cuphead alone. Not to mention, part of what made the genre difficult was to eat more quarters in the arcade back in the days. Maybe it is a reasonable issue to have in the game. I really hope you see where I'm getting at after such a long explanation. At first, I think the game did try to give leeways for players who are wanting to go through the game without dealing with the difficulty. Like how right after getting out from the tutorial, you can get 3 free coins from the first NPC you talk to. With that, before entering any levels at all, you can purchase a charm that gives you an extra hit point which increases your survivability. But when I found out you actually cannot get to the ending of the game by defeating the bosses in simple mode, my opinion changed quite a bit. The simple mode offers a simpler version of the bosses. Not only they lessen the available attack types and health, some phases of the boss are totally cut off. This directly reduces the best thing the game has to offer, which is the brilliant art and the surprising factor of the bosses. You get to see less transformations and fight an incomplete version of them. You could argue that simple mode serves as practice, but the fact that there are attack patterns and phases absent from it, there's no point playing it for practice. You still have to face all the attacks unfamiliar to you in regular mode. Simply giving players double the health points and pit them against the complete version of the boss will serve as a better practice mode in my opinion. What's worse is that you cannot enter the final fight by beating every bosses in simple mode. You have to defeat them in regular in order to get their soul contract to advance towards the ending of the game. I'm not fond with this idea at all. I think locking the ending out is too much. That means if you want to take it easy, you will not have the closure in your experience. Not alternative ending sort of experience, but an actual no ending for you sort of experience. Before even playing the game, I wonder was the game intended to be hard at the first place. Part of making a throwback retro games these days is to inject difficulty matching of those from the past, and it feels like Cuphead is trying to do so, which is totally fair. Run and guns were totally hard games in the past, and the target audience of Cuphead is clear. After knowing the simple mode will not get you to the end, I feel like the dev did have an intention of pushing players to experience the game in the manner they see fit. This is like the opposite of what I've said in my Bayonetta's video. In that video, I mentioned how the dev of Bayonetta lowering the skill floor by having an automatic mode built into it to serve as a consideration for the players. They put respect into how the players want to experience their game, and they pave way for it. It seems like Cuphead values that less, and it's a shame they decided to lock content behind their vision. But we live in a digital age now. We'll see if they'll create a patch to address this issue or not. So that pretty much sums up my opinion on the topic of difficulty. Looking back, it seems like more negatives have been said compared to positives. So I would like to neutralize the situation by pointing out some cool details included in the game before I wrap things up. I noticed every different kind of shots is a bottle of tonic when you purchase them in the store. So I assume the liquid is stored in the character's head like how a cup does, which is a cool concept that aligns with the character's design. But I hope they will show the Elder Kettle pour them into their cup heads in the beginning of the game in animation. Tapping the shoot button rapidly will not dispense shots faster than holding down the button, but there is a way to shoot faster. Switching your weapons rapidly while shooting will increase your damage per second, especially when one of your shots has a slower fire rate. I would like to assume this is intended by the developer, sort of like an advanced technique for higher skill play. There are also secret passages in the hub of each world that allow players to traverse onwards even if they haven't defeated the boss that unlocks the path. This also allows them to tackle other bosses if they hit a brick wall with one of them, which is pretty cool. There are also other secrets hidden in the world as well, but I'll not spoil the fun for you. As a game that caught the audience attention solely by visuals, the game sure delivers what people had expected. StudioMDHR not only captures the visuals, but also expands its quality with quantity, making the whole game a screen full of joy constantly. Despite having a few platforming levels, it still feels like a boss rush game, and due to that, the constant bombardment of excellent visuals benefits the format. It is truly a joy to witness all the bosses in all their creative forms. Thanks to the parry slap and the shrink ability, it isn't that basic of a run and gun game. These mechanics are enough to increase the engagement of the game, rather than just holding the shoot button and avoid the bullets. Though, I recommend you to change the default button mapping, since a bunch of people are having problems with it. Weirdly enough, not in my case. I played through it with my 360 controller just fine, using the analog stick and the default control scheme. The problems with the difficulty, the attack patterns, and mainly the grade requirements ultimately left some bad taste throughout my experience with the game. I find them lacking in substance, so I'll put it this way: it's good fun but not good challenge overall. I would recommend you to play the game for the visuals and neglect getting the perfect score, but if you want to take up the challenge, do get ready for some frustrating moments. Having a simple mode that includes the ending will be nice. I am fully aware that it is designed to appeal those who want to be challenged like the older games of the genre, but it's always better to have options that cater how the players hope to play the game. That way, both spectrums of players can enjoy the game, and the enjoyment of both sides will not clash with each other. Nonetheless, I still adore Cuphead in terms of what they have achieved. It is really a feat for them to create such a remarkable looking game, and solely for the presentation, I'm really glad Cuphead exists as a game in this current generation. Subscribe to my channel if you would like to see more reviews like this. Follow me on Twitter and ask me anything over there, or just leave a comment down below. And thanks for watching.